unabashed,
the most unpredictable,
becomes a headline,
the most volatile,
outrageous behavior,
unsubstantiated narratives, a battle of personalities.
Welcome to Grant Tamasha, a co-production of the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace and the Hindustan Times. I'm your host, Milan. In 2014, soon after coming to power, the BJP government of Narendra Modi decided to abolish India's decades-old planning commission, replacing it with a new government think tank meant to facilitate cooperative federalism. For years, the Planning Commission devised detailed 5-year central plans meant to guide India's economy and allocate funds from the center to India's states. 8 years on, the Planning Commission may be gone, but it is hardly forgotten. A new book by the historian Nikhil Menon, Planning Democracy, How a Professor, an Institute, and an Idea Shaped India, provides a wide-ranging history of the marriage between liberal democracy and a socialist economy. In doing so, it uncovers the way planning came to define not just the economy, but the nation itself. Nikhil Menon is an assistant professor of history at the University of Notre Dame. He joins me on the show from South Bend, Indiana, to talk more about his book. Nikhil, good to talk to you.
Thanks so much for having me, Milan.
So I want to jump right in and talk about the book. You note at the very outset that India's very unique planning project was one of the, and I think these are your words, post-colonial world's most ambitious experiments. Now, with the benefit of hindsight, it has become very popular today, as I'm sure you know, to view planning as a very sort of top-down, hierarchical, kind of socialist vestige that curbs a lot of individual freedoms. But you note that supporters of the planning project actually argued the exact opposite, right? That planning would lead to a vast increase in freedom. So maybe we could start there. You know, what was the logic of connecting planning with democracy and freedom?
Yeah, Milan, you're right to characterize that as the view of planning, that it is top-down and stifling, and that is the view of planning today. But I think what my book tries to demonstrate is that this wasn't the view of planning held by most Indians, as you pointed out, in the mid-20th century, because across political persuasions, Indians believed that state-led planning was the path to development and prosperity. And the quote there of planning effectively leading to a vast increase in freedom is Jawaharlal Nehru's. And I think what he meant by that is that free markets, he believed, could deliver little by way of freedom to India's overwhelmingly poor population, and that it meant little for a destitute, landless laborer, say, to have the notional freedom to purchase luxury consumer goods, the theoretical freedom to do something without the actual ability to do it meant nothing. And so supporters of planning believed that the planning method would provide that capability to participate in a modern economy, and that the freedom from hunger and poverty, rather than the theoretical liberty to make unlimited consumer choices in a capitalist system, was the freedom that they were speaking of. Now, of course, critics of planning would say that this is a very false dichotomy, that you can improve material capabilities along with a less state-directed economy. But I think that was the logic that was prevalent at the time.
You know, what was so interesting to me, Nikhil, is the degree of consensus there was around planning, right? So it was very much part of the kind of ideological zeitgeist of the time. It wasn't simply what we think of today, again, as sort of a leftist socialist orientation, sort of that side that backed this vision. It was also, industrialists, it was civil society, economists, what you point out that, at one point, Amartya Sen, Jagdish Bhagwati, Manmohan Singh, three of India's biggest economic lights, were all votaries of planning, right? And so you have this very nice line where you say almost everyone across the ideological gamut seemed to have developed a taste for planning and their own unique recipes. Did that consensus surprise you? To tell us a little bit about what that looked like and who the dissenters were, because obviously there were people who were trying to poke holes in this argument.
Yeah, I think that you're right that does come as a surprise to many, and it came as a surprise to me as well when I entered the archive. I, of course, was aware that the Congress supported it, that Nehru supported it, but I think part of the surprise perhaps is also generational. I grew up in an India that was post-liberalization, and these ideas seemed so associated with one particular political party, and especially with the figure of Nehru, that I assumed that this was a project that was pushed through by sort of the force of one political party's dominance. But I think what I discovered through the research is that, and what the book tries to do is to recover this intellectual context in the mid-20th century, where even before independence, planning is proposed by India's engineers like Visvesvaraya, by Meghnad Saha, amongst politicians in the Congress party. It's the economic modernizers as opposed to the Gandhians who back planning. And so apart from Nehru, it's actually Subhash Chandra Bose that promotes the idea of planning in the Congress party and sets up the National Planning Committee. Amongst industrialists, as you mentioned, G.R.D. Tata, G.D. Birla, some of the iconic figures of Indian capitalism, Lala Sriram, all of these people are promoting planning in different forms, but all of them are promoting state-led planning. And so we come to this period in the 1940s where there is a Congress plan, there's an industrialist plan, there's a Gandhian plan, even the Muslim League has their plan, and of course the communists have their own plan. And in fact, just state for a moment, it's not just my surprise was not just about how popular planning was in India, but how popular planning was globally at the time, right? We seem to think of the economic battles of the mid-20th century in this sort of through this Cold War lens of capitalism versus communism, that everybody who believed in communism must have had a planned economy. But of course, in the mid-1940s, the Labour government that comes to power in Britain under Clement Attlee has planning and a planned economy on its manifesto, right? So the party that is in charge of this vast British Empire is declaring its belief in socialism and in a planned economy. You asked about the dissenters, and I think that though they are important figures, they were few and far between. So one set of critics of the plan model were Gandhians, right? Beginning with Gandhi himself. The Gandhians argued that the planners' obsession with industrialization and centralization and urbanization went against Gandhi's own belief in a village-based, decentralized, agrarian, economics-based model of how India should be organized. So someone like J.B. Kripalani, Acharya Kripalani, would fall under that category, right? A one-time Congress member, in fact, one-time president of the Congress party, becomes a critic of the plans along those lines. Another set of economic conservatives are people like Rajaji, C. Rajagopalachari, and Meenu Masani, who would form the Swatantra Party in 1959, a liberal, avowedly pro-market political outfit. Amongst economists, again, there were very few critics. And to sort of name check a few, the most prominent would be B.R. Shenoy, but apart from them, the sort of so-called Bombay School of Economists, C.N. Vakil and Brahmananda. In fact, interestingly, Brahmananda talks about why there weren't more critics of the plan. And what he says is that it was an extremely hostile environment to be critical of planning in the 1950s and 60s, because being critical of the plan, he says, was tantamount to being branded anti-nationalist, sometimes even being branded a CIA agent for being critical of the second five-year plan. Interestingly, though, Brahmananda's sort of anger is not directed towards Mahalanobis himself, who he describes as a sort of brilliant man with fresh ideas, but at this overwhelming ideological context in which the plans bore a very heavy weight.
You know, you talked a little bit about the research you did. You mentioned sitting in the archives for countless hours going over documents, and maybe this is a good time to sort of pause and ask you about method. You mentioned that it has been very hard for researchers to access Nehru's unpublished papers. You lament that many of the original Planning Commission files were burned, thrown away, discarded. No one thought they were of particular value. So tell us a little bit about how you went about reconstructing the history of planning without the perfect set of archives at your disposal.
I should begin by saying that the perfect set of archives is an impossibility. And this is a very common complaint amongst historians. We always want more. But I think particularly for historians of independent India, this is a unique challenge because we are also dealing with the law, which is a 30-year prohibition on accessing government documents. So what that means effectively is that, for example, government documents that are being produced today will be available to the historian only in 2052, right? So there's actually a smaller window that historians are operating with, and layer upon that, all the difficulties of accessing Sarkari documents, and you can imagine the problems. Now, with the Planning Commission, what I was very surprised to find, actually quite shocked, was how paltry the archival record was at the National Archives, given the size and importance of this institution. In fact, it was another scholar, Vivek Chubbar, who came to the conclusion after his own research and using connections going up to the finance ministry and the prime minister's office when he was doing the research, that at some point he believed that a clerk or someone just decided that lots of these documents were of no value to anyone and nobody seemed to be picking them up and so just disposed of them, that might be one explanation. So it was a fairly serious challenge, but as scholars and as researchers, as you know, you have to find ways around this. And luckily for me, what are available are the private papers of many of the people that sat on the Planning Commission. And so what I was able to do is to use the papers of people like Mahalanobis, whose papers are at the Indian Statistical Institute in Calcutta. C.D. Deshmukh was a finance minister, Gulzarlal Nanda, and sort of use the private papers and correspondence of these people, which often were also part of the Planning Commission's records, to recreate some of the context, and then supplement that with documents produced by international organizations like the Ford Foundation or the US State Department records, which I found in Cambridge, in the UK. And for the second part of my book, I try to use a wider sort of resource base by looking at films, sort of listening to songs, watching documentaries made in the period, reading plays and novels, and sort of use that as a different kind of evidentiary base to provide a sort of more fine-grained analysis of the period.
You mentioned Mahalanobis a couple of times, and so maybe it's a good time to sort of bring him into the conversation. To the extent you have a kind of central character in the book, it is really he, this very unique, brilliant physicist turned statistician. I think most of our listeners have at least heard the name, although they may not realize the extent of influence and power he wielded in the early days of the Republic. At one point you say that, there's this popular view that's sort of been formed that Mahalanobis was influential because he was tight with Nehru, right? Essentially that was sort of his in. But the truth you uncover is much more complicated, So tell us a little bit, how do we understand the role that he played in the mid 20th century, right? Because even today, much of his legacy, right, is still there for people to see and to review.
Absolutely. P.C. Mahalanobis is quite simply was simply one of the most influential Indians of his generation. He is this culturally refined Bengali physicist who turns to statistics after being trained at Cambridge University. He was a global pioneer in the use of large-scale sample surveys. The founder of the Indian Statistical Institute, which continues to be an institute of excellence in India. By the time of independence, Mahalanobis was crucial to the setting up of the National Sample Survey in India, to national income accounts, which are the precursors to GDP calculations in India, and to bringing India its first two digital computers. And with the second five-year plan, Mahalanobis effectively becomes the author of the economic template that India follows right up to economic liberalization. And so a very, very significant figure. And I think that the way in which it has been commonly understood is that Mahalanobis, as you said, was a friend of Nehru's, and that's why he was able to do all these things. And I think that is too easy an explanation, that this one person was able to do all these things just because he happened to be a friend of Nehru's. The question I asked myself was, well, why didn't Nehru have other friends? Did he not know other economists, for example? Certainly he did. So what is it about Mahalanobis that gave him this kind of influence? And I think that for that, we need a more structural explanation. And that, I think, is that by the time India's independence, Mahalanobis already has a formidable reputation. And the reputation is that as a statistician, as a global leader in the emerging science of sample surveying, which is coming to be seen as being very important for all kinds of calculations about the economy. And what planners were realizing through the late 1930s and early 1940s is that if India needed to plan, it needed a base of data in order to be able to do so. And so both Mahalanobis and the Indian Statistical Institute present themselves as solution to this problem of big data. That Mahalanobis says that if you allow me some license, I will be able to set up the National Sample Survey, I will be able to calculate India's GDP, and using that, the planners can conduct them, can sort of run their models. And I think that is the context in which it becomes likely for a statistician to sort of almost overshadow other professional economists.
So I think it's worth sort of stopping because I don't think there's such a great appreciation about this today, and we can get more into maybe what that's the case later. The Planning Commission, the Indian Statistical Institute, the Central Statistical Office, CSO, the National Sample Survey Organization, all of these became models that were viewed as essentially the gold standard for countries around the world, not just the developing countries, but developed countries as well. And, when we focus on the crisis in Indian statistics today, it's worth remembering how significantly the situation has changed from 7 decades ago, right? So maybe just tell us a little bit, Nikhil, about, how was the statistical establishment viewed by the rest of the world in the 1950s and 60s? What kind of role did it sort of occupy in that broader kind of, public imagination?
I mean, it was viewed with admiration, Milan, even with awe in some cases. The sheer scale of the National Sample Survey in the 1950s seemed to be foolhardy to many statisticians working in America at the time, some of whom were very sympathetic to what Mahalanobis was trying to do in India. And in the book, I try to talk about some of the challenges which I think we overlook today. The first National Sample Survey, which was conducted in 1951, they had to deal with these surveyors trying to talk to people in dozens of different languages, using different units of measurement, crossing snow-filled mountains, thick forests in which they reported they encountered man-eating tigers. They had to deal with tribal populations who did not understand what these people were after and what kind of information they were trying to glean from them. So the National Sample Survey, which was established in the early 1950s, is used, as you said, till this day to help with all kinds of measurements, such as knowing India's poverty line. Statisticians at the time thought that no country in the world, in fact, it's a quote from Edwards Demings, I'm sort of paraphrasing, he said that no country in the world, either underdeveloped or developed, has as much of a wealth of information about its citizenry as India does through the National Sample Survey. Many decades later, the Nobel Prize-winning economist Angus Deaton would say that, I think what he said that where Mahalanobis and India led, the rest of the world followed. He was talking about the establishment of these household survey data, which is now being used by not just the UN Statistical Commission, but also the UN Subcommission on Sample Surveys, both of which Mahalanobis had a seat on. And they've also now been incorporated into the World Bank's flagship sort of household survey programs, which has been conducted since the 1980s in several countries till today. So in some ways, this is a genuine contribution to social science from a homegrown Indian institution.
Hey, Grant Tamasha listeners. Thanks for listening to the podcast. Putting this show together each week is a labor of love, but it takes a lot of work to put out a great show every week. If you'd like to support the work we do at Grant Tamasha, please visit ceip.org/donate. Don't forget to subscribe to us on Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, Spotify, or on your favorite podcasting platform, so you'll be the first to know when a new episode rolls out. I mean, I think there could be people listening to this podcast thinking that, we're just two nerds kind of nerding out about this, but this is truly important stuff, right? All of our conversations we have today about poverty, about inequality, about, population, demography, all of this stems essentially from the innovations that Mahalanobis helped to kick off in India, and then were replicated, and of course refined and adapted in other places. When you look at the book, there's sort of these two parts of it, right? I mean, the first half of the book is really looking at the kind of top-down, more technocratic, elite-driven aspects of planning in which ordinary citizens are sort of rows in a data set, right? But the second half essentially flips the script, right? It delves into this idea that planning was also a political project, a participatory democracy, right? That's one of the main arguments you make. And this is what you say, after all, at the end of the day, really distinguishes planning in more authoritarian context from India's brand of planning. And so, one of the things I found so interesting is there was this idea that you bring out that India's leaders, especially in the 1950s, had this idea of building quote unquote plan consciousness, right? What was this, and why was it so important to them, right? Because on the face of it, it sounds so abstract.
Yeah, I mean, there were these two terms that I found that cropped up in official documents and that really puzzled me. One was plan consciousness, and the other is democratic planning. And both these concepts, I would argue, smack of Nehruvianism, right? They're both socialist inspired, but not quite socialist. They're romantic in their vision, but often falling short in practice. So, democratic planning, which is the sort of broader umbrella idea, was the view that Indian planning had to be different from communist planning, because India, of course, was a parliamentary liberal democracy. And what this concept really tried to put together was a mixture of idealism about democracy and popular participation, the view that for plans to be successful, Indians really needed to buy into the project, that for this narrative of decolonization to work, this narrative of this new country emerging from 200 years of colonialism to work, Indians needed to be aware of what they were participating in. And that's the way in which citizenship truly came into its own in a liberal democracy. But part of it was also a realistic realization that with India's very limited state capacity, if citizens didn't voluntarily participate in these planned projects, that India would never succeed in these, that India's state capacity was just insufficient to deliver the plans without these kinds of unbidden contributions by citizens themselves. And so planning consciousness in some ways became the measure by which citizens had bought into the process of democratic planning, and to know the extent to which Indians knew about the plans. And I talk about different examples of this in the second half of the book, as you mentioned, in which India invested and spent money on roving publicity officers who traveled on bullock carts, on jeeps, on boats, carrying these publicity materials and small film projectors to try to educate, illiterate, poor villagers about the Panchvarsha Yojana, or the 5-year plan. It included, setting up a song and drama division in which, songs and dance was used to promote the plans, university planning forums across the country, and perhaps most intriguingly, and perhaps is something we'll speak about later, the Bharat Sadhu Samaj, which is the sort of Indian society for ascetics, by which the government effectively partnered with, Hindu ascetics and sadhus in order to promote and sort of meld the ideas of the Ramayana and the Mahabharata with that of the 5-year plans.
So you said earlier that, part of the research involved watching movies, listening to songs. This was not just your method of procrastination. This was central to the book. One of the amazing data points that you uncover is that in the second half of the 20th century, the film divisions of India was the largest producer of documentary films in the world. I think it had a catalog of more than 8,000 short films. You very nicely kind of elaborated why the government had so many reasons for publicizing these 5-year plans to try to develop this plan consciousness. But what do we know about the receiving end, right? How much resonance did this actually have with the population at large? As you mentioned, this is a population at the time rife with illiteracy, poverty, and so on and so forth. So, how was it received by the tribal, by the villager, by the farmer?
Yeah, I think that, perhaps, before getting into the reception, I should just say something about the films themselves, because I think that they're absolutely fascinating. And I discuss some of these films in the book, and luckily some of these films are now available on YouTube. There's one, for example, about a villager going to the Planning Commission and speaking to these sort of egghead, brainiacs at the Planning Commission. There's another about an alien visiting Earth every 5 years to time it with the sort of next successive 5-year plan to assess, with this villager, because the villager, is not able to see any progress. But the alien, when he comes on a spaceship, is able to see these, smoking chimneys, these new industrial plants that are put up, etc. So, what was the reception? The government of India, of course, was also interested in this and commissioned a report in the early 1960s. And the report was quite scathing. It suggested the Indian populace didn't really know very much about the plans, but it did acknowledge that doing so was a Herculean effort. That it said, and I think I'm quoting it right when it said that when it said that India lived in the 10th, 15th, and 20th centuries simultaneously, but it also interestingly found that actually rural audiences were much more open and receptive to this kind of messaging than urban audiences were. But while the government's efforts might have met with mixed success, I also talk about how outside of the government sphere and outside of these official outreach programs, one other way of measuring the levels of planned consciousness, as it were, is by looking at popular culture. And we have novels, for example, such as Jhuta Sach, which is one of the sort of iconic post-partition novels by Yashpal, in which one of the key protagonists is a member of the Planning Commission. We have popular plays like Hamara Gaon that talks about what the Planning Commission and planning is doing for the country. There are Bollywood movies like Naya Daur featuring Dilip Kumar, or Char Dil Char Rahe with Shami Kapoor and Raj Kapoor and Meena Kumari. There are Bollywood songs sung by Mohammad Rafi and Lata Mangeshkar, all of which are talking about the plans and five-year planning. And so I think that that is another way by which we can access just how suffused Indian culture and popular culture had become with the plans, how the plans sort of seeped from the boardrooms in Delhi and from Yojana Bhavan to across the country to movie theaters.
You mentioned that number one, the government devoted a significant amount of manpower, resources into these planned publicity efforts. The report that was done was indeed very scathing. One of the things that you reflect on in the book is, okay, so learning that this is having very mixed impact, why does the government remain so committed to these outreach campaigns, right, which have all these various tentacles spread throughout the country? I'm curious how you would respond to that. I mean, is this just a question of bureaucratic inertia, or is there something more nuanced going on that explains why they felt it was so important to kind of continue this kind of investment?
No, I think that's a great question. And it's one that I kept going back to. And I think that the answer is that there is bureaucratic inertia. Of course there is. But it's also that when the government of India is looking at these programs, it sees their failure not as an evidence that the mission is wrong, but that the method is wrong, right? And so the reason that they keep up with this rhetoric is because this idea of democratic planning had become quite central, at least to the Nehruvian state's self-conception, its vision of what its legitimacy was based on, that its legitimacy was based on delivering development in a particular way through democratic planning. And that the idealistic version of this was that Nehru and the Nehru government believed that this was the way in which India was fulfilling its mission and a promise that had been made through decades of anti-colonial movement before independence. And so I think moving away from this would have meant that then what was very different from Indian planning and communist planning, right? At that point, it just became planning by experts, which, as I argue, effectively it was. But in order to distinguish Indian planning from that of communist Soviet planning or Chinese planning, the government, I think, was very invested in promoting this message, and I think it became a part of the government's own self-definition. But less idealistically, as I also mentioned earlier, it was also necessary to do so because the government believed that without the citizens participating in these plans, for example, through voluntary contributions to the Bharat Sevak Samaj, where you could volunteer, as I point out, tens of thousands of Indians did, to contribute to building your village dispensary, or to building the school walls, or to building a road in the village. Those also made it easier for the government to fulfill the five-year plans. And I think the final part of it is that making citizens believe that they were part of this grand adventure, this grand project, made difficult times more palatable to the citizenry, right? When citizens had to tighten their belts, they weren't saying, they were at least able to say, at least the government believed, they were able to blame it on where India was historically, as opposed to blaming it on government policies per se.
I mean, I thought it was interesting, and you sort of end the book this way, where you talk about the kind of principal tenets of the kind of, post-independence order, in which you talk about secularism, democracy, and planning kind of in the same breath, right? And I don't know if you agree, but I think sometimes we forget about what planning, right? We talk a lot about the importance of these first two pillars, but planning is seen as perhaps not on par with the other two. Is that fair to say?
Yeah, I think that in the scholarship, it certainly is not seen as on par with the other two. And I think that my book, in some ways, is an argument to include the third in that category. And it's because when you look at the rhetoric of the Congress Party, and which then becomes the Indian government post-independence, planning is littered across the landscape. It's in the planning. The language of planning is used when talking about Hindu-Muslim rights. The language of planning is talked about when talking about economic development. It's talked about in all kinds of contexts. And I think that planning became, in some ways, the meta-narrative of the post-independence Indian state. It became the 5-year plans, as I write, became a sort of alternate national calendar and a way by which to measure the progress of the nation, not just in terms of the economy, but because of this other ideological component of democratic planning of what a social movement dedicated to development could be. And so the conception of Indian citizenship became that you weren't just given or granted these rights as a citizen in a liberal democracy, but that in some ways you had to, that these rights came with duties and obligations. And that obligation was to participate in the planned development of this nation, in contributing through these sort of maybe voluntary contributions to India developing. And so I think that planning really was a sort of obsession of the post-independence Indian state. And I think that because of the fact that planning recedes in importance, from the 80s onwards, I think that we think of secularism and democracy as being really the sort of mainstays of the post-independence state. But I think that planning needs to be brought back into the conversation.
The Mahalanobis story in some ways has a very unhappy ending. For starters, the second plan, which he was so central in putting together, was heavily criticized for many things, including its neglect of agriculture, contributing to a foreign exchange crisis in the midst of the second plan. The third plan then, which would be from about 1961 to 1966, in your words, grossly underperformed. What impact did the outcomes of planning have on Mahalanobis the man, and then the functioning of the institution of the Plan Commission, more generally?
Mahalanobis had faced pushback, from, even before the second 5-year plan had begun. There had been complaints by Indian diplomats that Mahalanobis was cutting deals in the Soviet Union and in America, that he was being handed official letters in Bern in Switzerland that was actually meant for an IFS officer, and that he was, stepping on the toes of the Indian Foreign Service. But in the end, he got away with it because, as Nehru once said, he prefers one technocrat to 4 bureaucrats. Even within domestic policy, Mahalanobis's quite amazing rise to power wasn't really appreciated by figures within the Planning Commission. You have to, realize that Mahalanobis's sort of swift rise was seen as a coup in Delhi. It was seen as the Planning Commission being sidelined by an outsider. And so insiders like V.T. Krishnamacharya and Tarlok Singh, who were in the Planning Commission, and later finance ministers like T.T. Krishnamacharya and C.D. Deshmukh, all of them really pushed back against Mahalanobis and his ideas. Mahalanobis, in fact, writes in his letters about how there was whispering, dark whispers behind his back about how they were trying to sabotage him, and he even claimed close to resigning a few times. But yes, you're right to point that, yes.
But and Nikhil, just on this point, sorry to interrupt you. I mean, it wasn't just from the Planning Commission where the opposition. I mean, it was also people thought like he's displacing the Council of Ministers, right? He's displacing the cabinet because he's been given this outsized importance, right? And what about the Finance Ministry? What about the Commerce Ministry? What about the Foreign Ministry?
Yes, so I think that those are two different forms of critique that came Mahalanobis' way. So the critique that I was outlining was a critique that came from within the Planning Commission itself. And I think what you are pointing out very rightly is that there was a critique of planning itself, of the Planning Commission itself as a body, which is that the Planning Commission took on powers that perhaps should have been under the Finance Ministry. And so there was always a tussle between the Finance Ministry and the Planning Commission. But what I'm trying to point out is that there was, even within the Planning Commission, it wasn't as if Mahalanobis could say and sort of declare what he wanted and have it be done. And so, yes, you're right to say that there are different pressures within the Indian government that are working against Mahalanobis, and for some time he's able to sort of keep it at abeyance. But eventually, with the failure of the second 5-year plan, you're right to say that these powers begin to erode. And with the second 5-year plan, the third 5-year plan, by the late 1960s, India has seen 2 5-year plans not meeting expectations. India's been at war in 1962 and 1965. By 1966, there have been poor monsoons and harvests. and also the currency devaluation in 1966, all of which together, I think, combined with the death of Nehru himself, leads to a diminution in the powers and the prestige of the Planning Commission, and with that of Mahalanobis as well.
Nico, one of the things that I wanted to ask you as a way of sort of wrapping up this conversation is a little bit about the current moment, right? You note that industrial policy is back with a vengeance. We could say that this is true not just in India, but in the world over. We're having a lot of conversations in the United States about this. But you do go on to say that, at least as far as India is concerned, what distinguishes the present moment from the initial post-colonial experience is a quote-unquote official anti-intellectualism that manifests in the short shrift given to expertise, end quote. So, I guess this is a time to ask you about something which I think, many historians wouldn't like to comment on, which is, current events, but I can't resist. How would you describe the current state of India's statistical sort of data architecture in light of, as you mentioned, 50, 60 years ago, it was seen as essentially the exemplar for the world?
I think that the present government's attitude towards experts and expertise is quite obvious. It's apparent that independent-minded intellectuals and universities are viewed either with suspicion or, sometimes just outright disdain. In the last 5 years, outside of statistics, we've seen 2 central bankers who've resigned due to perceived differences with the government. We've seen the vilification of an entire university, JNU, the jailing of government critics who are intellectuals. In my own field, in history, there's a concerted effort to rewrite history to suit a Hindu nationalist agenda. And in the economy, I'd say that perhaps the most cataclysmic impact of this antipathy towards experts was evident with demonetization, a quite monumental move that was based on precisely zero professional expertise. And so in terms of India's statistical architecture, more specifically, I think that the situation is quite similarly dismal. A couple of weeks ago, The Economist carried a piece that described India's statistical system as crumbling. Over the last 5 years, we've discovered that, as I write, that good data is not always good politics. And we've seen National Sample Survey results suppressed, certain other studies discontinued. And while that might seem arcane, the effective result of that is that economists today do not have a reliable or robust baseline by which to measure India's poverty. The government keeps claiming things about poverty alleviation, but we have no independent way of measuring these things because because we do not have these survey results anymore. And when these survey results are leaked, sometimes we find out that it shows record levels of unemployment or declines in household spending. And this is, this, of course, is not just my opinion, far from it. As I mentioned, there's a piece in The Economist just recently about it. And the critics of this have ranged from, MIT to JNU, from Jean Drèze and Arvind Subramanian and Raghuram Rajan to Abhijit Sen and Abhijit Banerjee, internationally to Tom Piketty and Angus Deaton, Esther Duflo. So this is a sort of widely remarked upon and widely observed phenomenon that India's statistical infrastructure is going through a crisis at the present moment.
Nikhil, just one final question. I mean, I think, we spend a lot of time, myself included, thinking about how India has changed post 2014. But you do note in the book that some of the roots of data, of statistics, of institutional decline did have pre-2014 origins, right? Are we able to kind of parse out the sort of attribution, right? I mean, people had been commenting how, there were questions about NSSO methodology, a question about talent, a question about retention, a question about, again, state capacity. Was this a sort of gradual decline that's now all of a sudden been accelerated? How would you kind of describe, if you could, the kind of trajectory, say in the past couple of decades?
I'd say that the trajectory is that its high point perhaps in the 50s and 60s and 70s in terms of, at least in terms of the data. No institution was above political meddling under Indira Gandhi government. But still, India's statistical records, as attested to by scholars on the subject, like Angus Deaton and Martin Ravalian, etc., have remained quite robust. I mean, so the data has to be separated from the economic policies that the governments pursued. And so I think that what we've seen is that after 2014, for the first time in 2017, 2018, an NSS or National Sample Survey result was not released, right? That is the first time that something like that has happened, or that is the household survey consumption data was discontinued. The survey was discontinued entirely. And so I think that we are seeing an inflection point. We are seeing not just routine government interference, but we are seeing a fundamentally different attitude towards the data and what it says about the government.
My guest on the show this week is the historian Nikhil Menon. He is the author of the new book, Planning Democracy, How a Professor, an Institute, and an Idea Shaped India. Here's what the historian Sunil Amrith had to say about the book. Written with wit and energy, impeccably well-researched, Planning Democracy makes a bold new contribution to our understanding of the Indian state after 1947. Menon's is the best history we have of India's great experiment of statistics, a data-driven attack on social and economic inequality that aimed, not always successfully, to be compatible with participatory democracy. Nikhil,
Thanks so much, Milan. It was a real pleasure.
Grant Tamasha is a co-production of the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace and the Hindustan Times. This podcast is an HT Smartcast original and is available on htsmartcast.com. India's fastest growing podcasting platform. You can also find us on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Stitcher, or wherever you get your podcasts. Don't forget to rate and review. Helps others find the show more easily. For more information about the show and to find the writing we reference on this week's episode, visit our website, granttamasha.com. Production assistance comes from Caroline Duckworth, Tim Martin is our audio engineer, and Cliff J. Pranada is our executive producer. Thanks for listening, and see you next week. Congrats again on the book. It was an eye-opener for me in so many ways. Thanks for taking the time to talk to us about it.
This was a Hindustan Times production brought to you by HT Smartcast.
HT Smartcast.